Hello, hello. Welcome back to B2B Growth. I am Erik, founder and CEO of Postal.io and your host for today's episode. Today is our second segment in Postal's Neuromarketing series on B2B Growth. In our first episode, we focused on understanding what neuromarketing is, and today we are here to discuss on why neuromarketing matters and what B2B can learn from B2C. I'm pleased to be joined by a couple amazing guests today. Dr. Uma Karmarkar, PhD, an assistant professor at the School of Global Policy and Strategy. She also holds a joint appointment with the Rady School of Management at UC San Diego. Welcome, Uma.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And then we also have Dr. Ming, PhD, Associate Professor of Business Administration at the University of California, Berkeley. He holds appointments in the Haas Business School and the Hellis Wills Neuroscience Institute. How are you doing today, Ming?
Good. Hello.
Awesome. So let's just jump in on it. We spent the last couple minutes just chatting through some of the talk tracks. Obviously, people are super interested in the neuroscience world and the neuromarketing world and how it actually pertains to B2B. We know that there's been a tremendous amount of research in the actual B2C world, but we'll go ahead and start with Uma. The first question I have for you is, can you tell listeners a little bit about your background and a little bit about what neuromarketing means to you?
Sure. So my original training as a scientist was in the field of neuroscience, and I did what we call wet lab research, where I was working with neural tissue and trying to learn more about learning and memory and how we think about time and how cells use information that allows us to think. And you can kind of get the sense that a lot of those pieces relate to more complicated ways of thinking, like how to make decisions. So I shifted my career a little bit and went from the biology of how the brain uses information to more of the psychology and the marketing, the applied psychology of how the brain uses information to make choices. Now, again, you can do that more in the lab, so to speak, or you can do that in the kind of choices that are messy and complicated in the real world, and that's more the direction that I went in. So in addition to the neuroscience training, I started incorporating marketing application, and that's the kind of work that I do now. So my own personal specific interests are still about how the brain uses information, but it's how people think about using information to make decisions in settings like investing or buying or selecting careers, or all the kinds of choices that we make where we often have multiple options and we're trading off multiple pieces of information and we have to pick at the end of the day. So
I'm guessing it's extremely relevant right now, as well as people are making decisions from a political standpoint, from an entertainment perspective, certainly from a B2C perspective and purchases that they make online and those behaviors. It's very interesting that you actually are going in and have obviously the biology background of this, but now you've found that the combination of that biology background, understanding actually physically how it all works with the actual psychology behind it, that probably brings it all together.
That's the hope.
Yeah,
and I think you bring up a lot of really excellent points about the different kinds of domains. So often as scientists, what we try and do is find single principles or single perspectives or explanations for things that then spread out into a range of different applications. Like, do you make decisions in the grocery store the same way you make decisions online for commerce and things like that? Mm-hmm. I think when and to speak to the second half of your question about neuromarketing, the interesting question is recognizing, particularly from a firm's perspective, how different those things are, and then understanding whether we should be using the same brain and biological principles to apply to those different situations, whether we get more information as marketers by recognizing the differences, or whether it's more powerful to look at the commonalities. So I think, the range of applications that you described and the range of settings offers nuance and opportunity for either divergence or convergence. And that's a lot of what we do. So the benefit of the brain elements is that the idea is hopefully there's a like if not limited, let's say a useful defined set of things that help us think about choices and purchases and all of those financially colored applied choices that we make. But then that we can merge that with all of the reality of the world and the complexity, because as neuroscientists, we often try to pare things down to the bare minimum. And to do a good job as marketers, we really want to know what's the most relevant to us, you know, to make the B2B versus B2C distinction and know whether or not that distinction is important. So even if we don't take into account all of those differences, we want to acknowledge that they exist. And I think that's one of the really complex and lovely things that neuromarketing offers us, is the ability to be nuanced about that and to give that information and acknowledge both sides of those questions, both the one where we say, no, we're going to get simpler, and the one where we say, no, for this to be important, we need to make it more complex.
Awesome. Tough act to follow, Ming. Tell me about yourself and what you're studying and what you believe neuromarketing is to you.
Yeah, I received my PhD from Caltech in economics, and I came to neuromarketing kind of through neuroeconomics, which is very related. And I think the difference is neuroeconomics tries to care about kind of how the brain makes economic decisions, and marketing is, you know, as we'll talk about, is related to decision making and a lot more than individual decision making in terms of groups, organizations, kind of masses of or mass consumers, etc. And kind of where I see it is just build on what Uma said. Oh, and I've been at Berkeley Hospital the past 10 years, which is kind of remarkable when you think about it, or at least when I think about it. Yeah, so to build on what Uma said, I think what all of the neurosciences have in common in terms of the grand ambition is, I think, and I think a lot of people would agree, is in terms of sort of reverse engineering the human mind by understanding the brain and the behavior that that the brain is trying to implement. And the benefit, all the kind of different neuro outgrowth, I think a lot of them comes from that in terms of the application to consumer decision-making, managerial decision-making, patient decision-making, et cetera. And I think and I think we'll talk about in terms of B2B, there hasn't been nearly the amount of attention devoted to that. And I think there are some good reasons. I think historically, B2B often falls B2C, but I think there are a lot of really interesting lessons, as you've already sort of hinted at, in terms of what both neuromarketing and also B2C can offer to B2B.
Yeah, I would also say that the access to the technology to implement a true neuromarketing strategy isn't quite there yet on the B2B side of things, and you'll find that true B2C companies that have really implemented these types of strategies, where they're documenting the past in people's minds of that subconscious decision that they're making. And truly, it's almost like the science of decision making is neuromarketing. It's like, why are you making this decision? There are some decisions that you make that are conscious decisions and those that are subconscious. So it's almost like the decision making of the subconscious. And those companies on the B2C side of things who have really done a nice job with this, they've gone through those studies and actually created their own profiles of the brain, right, and reverse engineering that. So as we start to think about that, I think it kind of leads up to our first question for you folks, is that since we've seen so much effort being put in the B2C side of things over the last 20 years, have you had any experiences, Ming, with decision-making that has been driven by neuromarketing in the B2B side of things? Do you have any research that you found in the past that you find B2B companies have started using to make decisions?
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of kind of, you can sort of think of those as kind of marketing lores, or not necessarily lores, but like sort of received wisdom from generations before in terms of what really matters in B2B marketing. And one of the examples that or one of the recent areas of our research when it comes to sort of memory and decision making in terms of kind of top of mind processes. I think that's very much fits in very well in terms of these kind of received wisdom from, maybe previous generations of marketers, not just B2B, but also B2C. Kind of how important is being top of mind. Nobody ever gets fired for buying IBM, right? Like that's very much a B2B type of kind of scenario, but top of mind also affects, Google, it is Apple, et cetera, right? So any consumer brand really cares about being on the top of mind. And I think in recent years, particularly with the analytics revolution and all the massive amount of data, there's a lot of kind of pushback, at least from finance, accounting, or kind of very sort of data-driven marketing folks in terms of, who cares about top of mind? That's just kind of, I can measure its effect on my bottom line. And if that's the case, then maybe I'll just de-invest in that. Like, if you can't show me kind of the ROI for my brand awareness exercises, I'm just gonna defund you or reduce your funding until you can show me. Right.
Totally.
So that,
and we find that as sellers, by the way, and being in technology sales for the last 15 years, we have seen that happen and culminate. Before, you'd have a relationship with them. When I was an individual contributor, you'd have a relationship with this person, they'd have a budget, and you could run a solid sales process, and they would buy from me, and the product would be on them, right? They'd be on them to show the benefits of the product. Now, part of the sales process is very much analytical. When you're talking about technology or SaaS sales. And I would have to say that it can go as deep as other channels as well. If it's not saving you, money, decreasing your, increasing your quality, increasing your quantity, right? All those aspects of why you buy technology, you buy something that's being provided to you that you're not able to even get that funded to begin with. So it's even more selling on lore and brand name is actually a lot harder now, especially in today's day and age than it has been in the past. What are your thoughts around that, Uma?
I think one of the very superficial distinctions that gets made early on in marketing between B2B and B2C is that B2B is magically more rational, right? Like, we have all this nuance around B2C, and you're going to speak to your customer and shift their perspective, right? B2B is about price. Right. And it's a very unidimensional argument. And let's be fair, that will take you reasonably far in a lot of places. But it does miss quite a bit of other elements that are going on. So then if you take one end of the spectrum as B2B is just about price. The other end of the spectrum would be, you should be talking to the organizational behavior people. You should be talking to the management people about B2B, because it's about the kind of interpersonal relationship that you've been alluding to, that you had a relationship and you had a conversation, that there was a person who talked to another person. And, if it's just about price, you don't need to be there. You just send the quote, right? So clearly, if there's a negotiation process, if there's a conversation taking place, then there's something more than price, whether or not it includes analytics. So even for analytics, which ones, right? What's compelling? What's the broader scope? How do you intuit what elements are going to be the ones that are going to convince someone or make the play, even if their priorities are the ones defined by the firm? That still means that they're taking these pieces into a decision and weighting them and coming up with that piece, and you responding to that and understanding how they're thinking about it seems like it would help.
Many businesses have gone to pricing models to where, and especially in the tech world, that tend to be on the selling to the SMB or the mid-market, say at under a $10,000 annual spend, that they've been moving towards a model to where it's a self-service model, much like a B2C model, right? So before, if you were going to buy technology, buy a software, a hardware, or whatever else, you'd have to speak to a salesperson and go through a whole entire sales process. Now there's companies, like Postal included, that you could come in, you can start trying the technology, you can see how it benefits you, and you can make the purchase without even talking to anyone. And that is more aligned with what we find in B2C, but they give the option to talk to someone. And usually when you talk to someone, that price increases, right? And so there's a natural selection process that happens. And the real question, I'd love to hear your take on this. The real question is that which one is better? and because there's multi-billion-dollar companies like Slack and and Microsoft and all these companies that have provided you this self-service process, but there's also massively like a Salesforce or like a HubSpot, to where you can't try the product. You have to go and talk to somebody and see how this works in my workflow. So and from a branding perspective, but also there's a lot of neuroscience stuff in there. Like, are you empowering the buyer at an individual level, or you know what I mean? So there's a lot of that. I'd love to get your takes on that concept, because I think that's very relevant for our listeners.
Ming, you want to go first?
Yeah, so I think in terms of all of these kind of really sort of high level and vexing questions, I think clearly there's some balance that needs to be struck. And I think one of the potential values of neuromarketing for the B2B world is to sort of give better metrics of where that balance should be kind of struck, in terms of person to person kind of interactions, to kind of more impersonal sort of software produced and analytics driven type of sales process. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of this ends up being like in consumer decision making, in terms of the decision-making process of the manager or whoever's making the ultimate purchasing decisions. And what I think what you had alluded to with HubSpot and Slack is kind of the experience that they're selling oftentimes are complex enough that at some point you might benefit from talking to someone, right? Mm-hmm. So if you go, say, all AI and you strip away all of the kind of interactive layers, at some point, I think we've all been there as consumers, you have a really basic question that you just want to ask someone, and you're sort of banging your head against the wall, and it's like, why is no one picking up and answering me something that probably takes, right, like 5 seconds to answer?
And what percentage of those people are actually having that experience versus those that just want to do it themselves?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yep. And I think when it comes to sort of understanding the brain, understanding the mind, I think, I think ideally we would be able to, as researchers, give better kind of metrics of when it is that, or for whom and when they sort of have reached one end of it or the other, right? And I think those are very much, new questions that, frankly, I don't think we're only scratching the surface of.
Uma, in some of the research that we did, and to stay on this pricing side of things, which I think is really interesting, because to your point, B2B really does buy on price. I mean, if you get out of the price decision, then you're golden, right? If you can create relationship, and that's ultimately why we have salespeople, right? That's why we have marketers, to create human connection, to try to influence the buy, right? So, but the buyers are always like, I want to strip this down to only talk to you when I need to. And I'm fine with that. We're fine with that as well. But I'd love to kind of understand from you when you look at the kind of like, there's this herd mentality of like, oh, I should just be doing it this way. And then there's less of a herd mentality on the actual buying process through like people that are not involved with a group of people. So there's like people that buy in groups, and then there's people that buy on their own. I'd love to kind of understand from a research perspective, how you think those two groups differ in this pricing decision. When there's like a decision that needs to be made, like, I'll stop talking there, but what I'm trying to get to is like, there's a group buying decision, and then there's an individual in this like this buying decision. Tell me about how neuroscience and neuromarketing kind of influences that.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's neuroscience and the psychology here. We really get our best answers from taking the full spectrum of the information that happens, right? Whether it's a behavioral experiment or a neural one, we can pull that together. Mm-hmm. And there are actually two factors that you mentioned, right? A pricing specific compared to a non-price only decision, and then the individual versus the group. And the reason I'm making that distinction is actually some of my own research suggests that we have qualitatively different questions that we ask that have to be answered when we're making a decision where the price is the primary consideration versus the product being the primary consideration. So again, in my own work, it was more done at the individual sort of retail purchase level, but I've shown that when a price comes first, the qualitative question being asked is more along the lines of, is this item worth it? Whereas when the product comes first, the question that the neuroscience represented was much more about, do I like it? And those sound very similar. And, in some fields, they would be considered the same thing, right? But they're not quite the same thing. And particularly when you start thinking about functional elements for a company, is this worth it? Does this meet my minimum standard? Do I like it? Is how great is this? And those are different values to apply to a decision. And so if we start a decision in the price realm, we're looking for it to meet a minimum goodness. Whereas if we're starting it in the product realm, we're now looking for things to be, to wow us, to be amazing. The other thing is, the failure points are different. If we start in the price realm, if it's not good enough, maybe it's just not good enough at that price. Whereas if we start in the product realm, if it's not good enough, you don't like the product, right? It's not about the deal or the transaction. Your evaluation is really tightly tied to the product itself.
So
go ahead. Yeah,
that's great. I was trying to get there and trying to spit it out of you took it. So that's exactly where I wanted to go. The other piece to this is really about the price point. So what we've found as well is that, when we talk about buying on price, I've been in companies where we've tripled the price, and there was a perceived value that was in this price increase. They thought because the price was so high that there'd be a higher value and that the product would be higher. In Postal, in my current, the current company we're creating here, we're going through this whole entire realm of, do we triple the price? Will people see more value? The technology is better than our competitors, and a lot of the stuff we're putting forward has never been created before. So there is value there, but it's really it's the question of can it go both ways? Can you lessen a price to create more appetite for the product mentally, or increase? So how do you manage that when you're a marketer or you're a sales?
That is a bigger question. That might be my favorite, but let me try and speak to it, because I think what we can offer is a little bit of trade-off that we're making. I'm an academic. It's actually my contractual responsibility to say it depends as the answer to nearly every question you ask me. But let me give you some of those it depends elements.
Okay.
So on the value perspective, again, we can pin this to plenty of academic theory, right? This is transaction utility. This is seeing the value in the product. And there is a brain signal that correlates with the value of a transaction that we see. That has also been shown in neuroscience studies. So there's the neuro data, there's the marketing data, there's the strategy data there to know that that's beneficial, right? We know, we love a deal, and we love bundles and the way that that provides value for the company. And it's also very easy to justify, just to draw on a tiny bit of what you were saying about individual versus group decision-making. One of the challenges with a group is if you are representing a group, you're potentially constantly benchmarking your choice to the evaluation of whatever will happen when you take it back to your group or your company or whomever else. Whereas an executive decision gets to operate on individual perspectives. On the other side of things, when you ask about tripling the price, there's plenty of very traditional marketing about value versus cost plus pricing and presenting that value pricing. But we have some neuroscience data on that too. Some of this comes from research done by our colleague Hilke Plasman, and now a broader range of research that shows effectively what we've called a price placebo effect. So the idea that if you communicate a price, it's not just that, people think because, people sort of broadly or loosely think that because the price is higher, the product must be better. We there's data suggesting that people actually, their brain actually sees more value in the product when the price is higher. That effectively, you know, there are studies on wine tasting better in a way that's visible by brain scans when it's thought to be a higher cost wine compared to a cheaper wine. So people taste the exact same wine, they find out it's $100 versus $10, and the brain represents the wine as tasting better at the $100 price point.
You know what's interesting too is that there is a budget that's assigned to these purchases, right? So they have to spend their budget. And at the end of the day, if something is like a quarter of the budget, they still had that budget to spend.
Yeah.
So and there, by the way, and B2B is not like, you really are, maybe now is not a good representative, but in the massive bull run that we've had, you weren't compensated for saving money.
Right.
You actually were dinged because the next year your budget was going to be cut in half. So, or down to whatever you didn't spend.
Right.
So there's this like, there's this like non-optimal way that businesses are operating from a purchasing standpoint that actually has a lot to do with like the behavior of these purchases and what they're making.
Yeah. And a matching process between that budget, right? Like if you're giving me this budget, I've got two pieces of information. You have told me that this is how big of a deal this purchase should be. And if I don't max it out, am I really getting a deal? Because like you said, I'm not getting rewarded for saving money. Or did I underdo my decision? Whereas if I max it out, I've clearly got the best thing I could get, right? The best reward for that cash. Yep. So that budget is a critical point in that decision making. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think in terms of just to build on that, I think the focus on pricing in B2B really obscures just how important the other facets are, right? Like, so I mean, people say like nobody gets fired for buying IBM. I mean, there's most managers don't want to get blamed if a decision goes wrong. And so there's a natural kind of security or conservatism in there. So it really, and that's, I think, one of the opportunities for B2B marketing in terms of how to enhance or communicate the value of the product rather than just competing on price. Because everyone cares about price, right? But ultimately, especially if you're B2B, you care about what can the product do to make your business better, make your career improve.
I think it's going to be, so we talked a little bit offline earlier about, how do you measure these things and apply it to your business? We're talking about, a lot of B2C theory, or actually just research, not even theory anymore. It's research and these findings that are driving B2C companies that are developing marketing tactics that actually are based on science. Tell me a little bit about, Ming, was for you, tell me a little bit about some of the research that you've done. And when you think about practical application and how people actually use the data that's out there in the B2C, in the B2B world, and just marketers in general, and where they find that, what they should do with it, and what that next step would be to leverage it.
Yeah. So I think for these, it's useful to think about kind of the insights that both B2B and B2C companies want, and sort of go back from there. So I think in terms of the broader needs, one of them I think is kind of the validation of marketing insights. So for example, if you're having a brand campaign, sort of rebranding campaign, or any sort of large activity where you want to kind of change how people think about your particular firm or your particular product. Those are, massive undertakings, right? Of, rolling out kind of media campaigns, et cetera, product changes. And for those, there's really a lot of need to make sure that self-report that you get from interviews, from user testing, et cetera, are accurate and not subject to biases from whomever, right? From either the managers who are commissioning them because they have their implicit biases, from the survey takers, or the self-report generators, or the firms that's conducting them in between. And there, I think one of the value of neuroscience is being able to kind of validate some of these core insights without having to ask the explicit questions. So the analogy that I often give is in terms of kind of DNA test, right? The DNA test, really inefficient if all you have is a drop of blood or hair, and you want to find a suspect, right? But it's really good as if you have already a suspect, it doesn't match. So this is kind of something that we've done in terms of looking at, for example, brand personality, how people think about brands, whether it's, Apple or Google or Microsoft, etc. And whether it sort of corresponds to their verbal self-report. You might think that people can generate, whatever crazy things that they come up with, right? It's like Apple. It's like, oh, it's something I eat, right? Like it doesn't have to be Apple, the product. And and we can show that, you can actually validate these, that what they say is actually originally going on in their minds. And that gives you sort of the peace of mind that allows you to kind of take those insights and then apply them for your marketing actions. I think another one that we're currently working on is, which I alluded at the beginning, is in terms of kind of consumer memory and top of mind. So how do you predict, or how do you know whether something is top of mind, and how much does it affect people's decision making? So if McDonald's is top of mind, how much does McDonald's actually, how much does that process actually generate in terms of dollars and cents, versus if McDonald's, one popular thought experiment in branding is, if everybody woke up one day and they forgot about Disney, right? You forget all the experience that you've had with Disney, the movies you watched, how devastating would that be for Disney, the company? And the answer is, very obviously, it'd be kind of devastating. But how much value is there? That's something that we're sort of starting to peel back the layers for, and that's something that is a little bit less kind of obvious for B2B. But I think a lot of B2B companies have strong brand recognition, and they have, at least I would contend, very much the same challenges that B2C companies, in terms of both maintaining and investing in their brand value.
Absolutely, and the investments that they make internally in product development. A lot of, it's interesting. I think this is why there's so many technology startups, is because you have a concept, right? And this concept, I think it's going to solve this problem. And you're like, okay, I'm going to go do research on this problem, this ideation, research on that problem, and then I'm going to actually put together a platform that actually solves that problem. And there's so many solutions out there because of the individual problems that are occurring, that we think, and we don't have access to the science behind, is it actually relevant? And the user testing might be there, and you get influenced by investors, you get influenced by the VC market, you get influenced by partners, but is there truly a market opportunity for what you're selling? And I think that's obviously that's why there's so much technology. So we're closing out here, folks. It's been a very quick 30 minutes. I can't believe it's 30 minutes already. But I'd love to get your takes on. It's a little bit selfish, because what we're doing here at Postal is really helping understand how to leverage offline communication in this digital world. And we believe that there's a true combination of both of those efforts will increase the overall conversion rates of B2B companies. So, and I learned a lot of this because of selfishly all the stuff that I got in the mail from these B2C brands. And they were creating an experience, even to some extent smelling, like there were scents on the actual pieces of paper that I was getting that weren't like cologne advertisements. I'm like, what is this? Is so interesting. And so I've been challenging our customers and our prospects and our partners to start thinking about how offline communication can be leveraged through the system as well as digital. But a lot of companies still are like, we just don't know how to use offline, or if offline is even important. So in your experience, and we'll start with you, what has your experience been in and by the way, there's no right answer to this. I would love to know your thoughts, what is the difference between the digital interaction, something that is on a screen, versus something that is in hand? And do you have any research in supporting either or neither from a marketing standpoint? Yeah.
So I'm going to lean on colleagues again. There is some research, some done with the USPS actually, about the impact of digital versus paper. And, you know, at a very basic level, just as a neuroscientist, more broadly than even my own research per se, you know, you interact with the message, you see it. So where your eyes are going and the information you take in there is important. As you said, you know, when you get a piece of mail, some people are going all the way to smell. The actual linguistic processing is there, right? The words are on the page, or the image is on the page, whether it's on a screen or on a physical element. Yeah. But as you can imagine, with the physical element, you are holding something. You might need to unwrap it, you might need to sort it. So already from a mail perspective, you are, or a physical mail, like direct mail perspective, you are adding in one more layer of information and interaction that the brain is coding when you're doing this, right? So if you hold up a postcard, if you could send someone something in the mail where the postman held the postcard in front of them, that would be equivalent to what you're seeing on the screen, right? And then I would have a question. I mean, maybe it's weird to have that kind of personal interaction with your post person, but at a minimum, the literal information processing happening in your brain might be more comparable. But you pick it up, you collect it in the other letters. You maybe don't have 6 windows behind it. You have the opportunity to focus just on that information that you're holding. It has a feel to it. It has a texture. You're introducing something with your hands. You're introducing, you know, to get techie, really techie, we're going to say motor coordination. You're introducing the way that the paper feels, but also the actual action of it. It's a different set of signals that you send, and particularly given the glut of information in the digital sense, you could make an argument that that's become a novelty. So maybe when we were all doing catalog shopping, that wasn't such a special thing. If you're pulling up a Sears catalog 50 years ago and you get a piece of direct mail, maybe I'm having a completely different conversation about what that means at that point. But given the comparison that you made between the digital one and the physical one now, which again is just amplified by current events in so many ways, there is something unique and special about a piece of mail in a signal to noise kind of way, and in an unusual element, but also in terms of just the number of channels that the brain would need to process it in.
So you're almost processing that. It's like coding your brain. It's like a brand coding, right? So it's an interaction. So is you having like, so the real question, I guess, a follow up to that is, when your brain is coding this interaction, the physical interaction, which is another touch point, and that's another sense that you have, is it coding based on the brand or the information, or like, is there any tie to what your brain is coding? Or maybe it's just like, oh man, thank God I got a piece of mail, and then you just forget about what it is, and you just like, hey, I remember I got that mail. I don't know what brand it was. So what are your thoughts on that?
That's where the marketing part has to be pulled in to add to the neuroscience part, right? So that's our job, right? Is to figure out how to take advantage of the fact that this is mechanically, literally happening from the physical perspective, and then to make those connections and those attachments. So the studies I alluded to, I think there are a set done by Vinod Venkataraman and colleagues at the Fox School at Temple University. They look at the different aspects of memory and brand recognition, but in a sense, the default is not that haptics automatic, or the touch element automatically makes you code a brand. And I think, although Ming's the brand and memory equity, brand equity and memory person, I think he'd agree with that. I think the challenge then is to make it a neuromarketing point of view, as opposed to just the neuro or just the marketing, and to draw those connections. So we can think of it in terms of attention, right? You got someone's attention in multiple dimensions. How can we make the most of that? So I don't think there's a default coding where because you got the mail, now you remember the brand. But I think because people might pay attention to it, because you have those, maybe it's an unusual, I'm making this up, but maybe it's an unusual shape, or there's something really striking about it, or there's a weight to it, since you're taking advantage of the fact that it's a physical object that you can then use to associate with your brand in all the ways that marketing knows how to do. But again, taking into advantage that channel and building layers of this that's going to help you remember this, right? So it's easier to remember the word dog if you've just heard the word cat. Maybe it's easier to remember the brand if there's something important about the piece of mail that you got that links to something about the brand. The paper's heavier, it's the right color, it's Kodak yellow, it's, you know, those linkages that we're providing as marketing anyway. I think the argument I would make, and again, this isn't my research, but the argument that I would make is that that is where you have the opportunity to create those links that marketers should be looking for anyway.
Amazing. Yeah, Ming, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, to build on that, I mean, I think one of the very intuitive lessons I think here from neuroscience and psychology is kind of the importance of sort of coordinated or integrated types of messaging, right? So like to take the example you give, if you have like an interesting scent, right, associated with the postcard or whatever, if that's the only thing that you are, you know, putting scent on, and then that's not associated with the brand, it'll just be, you know, something that catches your attention, but isn't going to be very, you know, isn't going to make a dent in terms of, oh, I associate this with, you know, Postal or whichever company, right? There has to be, like Uma says, like Kodak or Tiffany, right? A lot of these B2C companies are, you know, they sort of have very sort of tightly integrated kind of these messaging campaigns where everything sort of reinforces everything else, right? And this is something where, you know, the brain is sort of a pattern completion machine. So once you've seen enough of that, I only need to see, you know, there's actually some very fun web experiments with you just see the font of some company or associated with some company, and you can guess what product or what company it is, right? And that's exactly the type of, you know, it's sort of these discipline, and over time you build up kind of these awareness and these associations that you can sort of leverage. But if you're doing them in terms of like, oh, here's something clever that I can do to catch people's attention, that might work in the very short run, but it's not going to particularly have a long run return for you.
Yeah, we found that some of the best organizations that are leveraging the offline right now have very timely and personal messaging to them, because you're selling from a person and not a brand, right? So there'll be brand recognition that's going to be poured on from the digital side of things, but because you're assigned a salesperson in many cases, you're actually able to create a personal relationship with that person. And then that person might have done research on you to know what wine you like, or if, you know, this is your favorite sports team. And as you start to, you know, manage the actual specific profile of the people that you're selling to, it becomes more impactful. And that's really where we're seeing the best brands leveraging, you know, our software and other ways to engage in the offline. So, well, this has been awesome. I really appreciate you guys spending time with me today. As you know, we're just huge proponents of neuromarketing and neuroscience and how it actually impacts the world of marketing, and specifically in the B2B side of things. So I appreciate you both being here with us today. Again, this was B2B Growth with Erik from Postal. Thank you for joining. See you next time. Sweet. Nice. I tried to, we could have gone for a very long time, completely off script. You guys had some great things. How do you think it went?
That's great.
Yeah, this was fun. Yeah.
Reaching out.
Cool.
Always a good sign to go off script.
One more thing, since it's your core competency, and I didn't want to jump in when it was you were clearly headed towards the wrap up. One of the things you mentioned about the personalization. So if I'm extrapolating from data I have that's actually more related, it was something on cybersecurity. One of the interesting things, and again, I was looking at this through online versus offline retail.
Yeah.
People treat trust differently if it comes into their physical personal space compared to if it's through the mediation of the screen. So even if I'm looking at the screen in my house, if I buy something online and it fails or my credit card information gets stolen, I treat that as less of a violation than if I went into a store and my credit card information was stolen. Like I went into a store, I bought a thing and I brought the thing into my house and the thing fails. So it's there's a separation that seems to be taking place in the digital channels, which has bonuses and detriments, right? The bonus for a digital company is if someone steals your password on target.com, you don't appear to care as much as if someone steals your information from a Target store.
Yeah.
So in many ways, that's helpful. But from your perspective, what it means is that there is something uniquely felt about having something in your space. So more than just the haptics, which I mentioned, which is where there's data, if I was going to extrapolate from my cybersecurity findings, I might argue that there's something unique about having a thing, whatever the thing is in your space. And then you're taking that to 11, so to speak, by personalizing it further for the individual.
I was just going to say that actually makes complete sense, because we think, and we've seen this actually happen, is that the impact, if you send something that is off-brand or just a bad piece of content, direct mail or a shirt or a pen or whatever else you send to your customers, some customers are like this is a good example. They're getting bottles of wine, but they're putting locks on the bottle, and they say, "Hey, call me to get this lock undone to open the bottle of liquor." And I'm like, that is not what first off, I can't support that, because I really believe that has a negative connotation. And it might go the complete other way, right? So whether it be branding or the experience of the direct mail that you get, like, it could make a much better impact in digital, or it could make a much worse impact than digital. So I don't know.
Yeah.
Pretty interesting.
Oh,
Well, Ming, I appreciate your time today as well. And I will send out, so this recording will go out probably the second week of September. And so we'll reference you folks on that. Also, we're fans of this space. And so anything that you would like us to put out there, we would be more than happy to put out from a relevancy standpoint. We're looking at probably doing some unique studies about B2B engagement offline. So we might call on you to support some of those efforts. But I really appreciate you guys' time today.
Absolutely. Yeah. Both ways. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for,
Awesome. Okay, thank you so much. I'll let you guys go. Take care.
Thanks.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.